Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, joined today by Lambda, by Mr. Turnip, by Ferro, and at some point here, once he gets out of his traffic mess, hopefully by Mr. Patriarch, and there might even be a special guest towards the end of this stream who can drop in for a bit so that we have Catholic representation as well. That is currently a glaring lack in the representation of various denominations. I apologize for it, but all my favorite fiery Catholics were unavailable today, and so we'll have to make do with the Protestant crew, or at least quasi-Protestant crew we have with us here. The Anglicans are arguably only 1 foot out of that domain. Yeah, I'm going to keep shilling to a minimum today so that we have as much time as possible to discuss our theme this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, which is whether or not the various Christian communities are able to cooperate with what's usually glossed as the dissident right, and if so, how. And where they must necessarily, because of their faith or faiths, draw the line. It's necessary for me to try to cut it very sharply at 2 hours because Apostolic Majesty has a stream coming up at 7 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. You guys can work out the math for the United Kingdom. And he's, of course, friend of the channel. And not only am I looking forward to getting over there and catching his stream live, I think many of the guests here today are. So to everyone who's listening, be aware that he's got a stream starting, which I really can't recommend more highly. In terms of shilling, there are my books, but I'll save you the pain of listening to me talk about them yet again. There are links for them. You can pick them up at Amazon. I want to thank the channel supporters. In particular, the mighty Mr. John Ski. Also, our guests for this afternoon, I've listed their channels with links down below in the description. So I recommend that you check all of them out. Ferro for art, aesthetics, architecture, and things of this sort. His channel excels in that respect. Lambda has a few things going on, but one of them that is noteworthy is Lambda Bible Studies. So I recommend that you guys check that out. And Mr. Turnip now has a channel of his own with at least 2 videos up on it last I checked. So I would recommend that everyone have a look at it. As I said, Mr. Patriarch, our Orthodox representative, will hopefully be joining us if he doesn't get chased down the street with a panga and cornered in some township. And later, as I said, we may well have a Catholic representative in, and I hope that will be the case. We'll have to see whether that guest shows up. I'd ask guys that you keep an eye on whether or not people pop in below if I miss them and let me know. So thank you all for being here. And I apologize for not stopping and saying hello to each of you, but as I said, I want to rush to get to the meat of the matter. And again, because of this 2-hour limit, I'm going to focus on 2 very specific questions. And, we can range further afield. These guys have kindly said that they would be willing to consider doing a part 2 to this. So it is very likely that we will return. But the 2 subjects that I want to focus on are, as regards Christian cooperation with the dissident right, are 2 things. One is the idea of anti-white attacks, the various, how shall I say this? Can the Christian communities and those who consider themselves to be, on the quote unquote dissident right, can they come together as people who seek to constructively respond to the anti-white behavior or activities and the promotion of anti-white ideas and standards, And the second aspect of this is the national traditions of white peoples. Note that I put an S on the end of that. That is in the plural. We're talking about different ethnic groups. So, can we all come together under one banner as regards the responding constructively and civilly and lawfully to the anti-white behavior and activities we see, as well as come together to preserve and protect our national traditions. So that is kind of the core of this. I'm sorry I have to do one last little bit of introduction for people who are not familiar with the strategy series. This is the fifth in this series. There's an introduction that is part one. In part two, I spoke with Josh Neal about the psychological aspects of people being in denial and having to be exposed to things that they might not wish to face. Actually, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. This is all about communications strategy. And the thinking behind this is that framing the story, framing the narrative, getting people on the same page, so to speak, raising a banner that has a few basic elements upon it that everyone can agree on. This would seem to be central to any constructive response to what's happening. And, the old expression is cat herding. And to a considerable extent, people on the right dealing with them, I'm sure many people have experienced this. It can be a lot like cat herding because everybody has their own little bailiwick that they wish to defend and their own favorite, villains and heroes. And so it struck me that we need to put together a communication strategy that has all the necessary elements to bring people together to do things that we need to do. On the one hand, you could say, well, I put it in my first video that you can either build or buy. That means you can sort of give birth and raise up, give birth to and raise up the kind of people you need, or you can sort of bring on side the people that otherwise might not be. And I know a lot of the people, particularly coming out of AA's channel, will be like, well, we're looking at conversion of elites. We're not focused on a great democratic movement that involves, the proles, the pedestrians, the great unwashed masses or whatever. But it doesn't matter whether you're approaching it in terms of the elite or the multitude, except in terms of fine-tuning messaging, because in either case, you're going to have to build or buy. You're going to have to capture disaffected elites, or you're going to have to create your own new group of them. And both those things entail presenting your case, your arguments, your ideas in such a fashion that they are not immediately dismissed. And this bears on things such as getting lawyers to come on board, getting people to give donations, being able to present your case in such a way that it is not immediately rejected. And unfortunately, for much of the dissident right, it's beyond the pale at present in terms of the Overton window. So that's background. As I said in episode 2, I talked with Josh Neal about the psychology, the resistance that people can experience within themselves to dealing with things that they might reject or be in denial about. I also did an episode with Apostolic Majesty on whether or not right-wing movements have been successful in the past in terms of looking at the lessons of history. Let me just jump over here so I can remember what all the episodes thus far have been, since I seem to be a little bit forgetful this afternoon.
Was the program as in the communication series?
It was originally intended to be, but I broke it out. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was part of what was confusing me. Yeah, so we had Josh Neal in 2. We had Apostolic Majesty in 3. He may be returning for another one because I fine-tuned those questions. In 4, I did an insight review and looked at next steps. And we've got this one today. And within the next few weeks, I should be speaking to Jason Kona and Tim Murdoch to pick up on communications lessons from the dissident right that have already been learned, things like best practices, so to speak. So that's another one coming up. But that should be enough introduction for the topic. I apologize for being long-winded. People can go back and check the previous episodes where they're interesting to them. I guess the last thing is for for each of you, before we get started, I'll throw a few basic questions out there. But before we do that, maybe you can tell our viewers what particular denominations you're associated with, and to whatever extent you can speak for or about those denominations. Maybe start with you, Lambda, since your mute is not even on.
Yes, that implies I'm champing at the bit to go. And
I want to say, just a Chad.
Yeah. And in a parallel universe where I'm not on this stream, I would be very excited to listen to it. So I feel I'm in fine company this evening. Denominationally, I attend a Baptist church. Baptists in the UK are slightly different from Baptists in the US. I recently had a bit of a brainwave, and I don't know how true this is, but I think if you imagine the American founding spirit distilled into a Christian denomination, that would be the Baptists, whereas the Anglicans is probably the kind of British Empire distilled into a Christian denomination. People may disagree with me on this, but so I think probably that maybe I'm non-denominational is the other term that people throw around that basically means the same thing as Baptists. But yes, either way, Protestant. And the one thing you can say about Protestants is that they at least turn up to streams on time.
Indeed. The Orthodox are still hanging and the Catholics aren't, and we don't even have them appearing on the horizon. Well, I do recall about Baptists, and I think it's a very telling statement. The old joke down south is there is no Baptist sect too small not to schism again.
Yes.
And yet again. So.
Well, yes. If the world is 1,000 tiny Liechtensteins of Christianity, then they're all Baptist.
Yeah, yes. And I should probably say regarding myself, I am not a Christian. I was baptized Catholic. I was never confirmed. It is probably the version of things that makes the most sense to me. But as I've said in previous streams in the past, simply growing up in America means that there are going to be aspects of Protestantism that are just sort of encoded into you, whether you're conscious of them or not, due to the nature of the nation's history. Though I suppose there's maybe some person from backwater Maryland who, has some core Catholicism to them that it's difficult to detect, or difficult to deny, I should say. I'm sorry, here I am not being terse again. Turnip, perhaps you can tell us where you're coming from.
All right. I'm going to be, I guess, the spokesperson today, or that sounds kind of wrong, for the Confessional Lutherans. That is they are the conservative Lutherans, the ones that still hold to any Lutheran confession, that haven't thrown them out. Not the ones waving the rainbow flags in the north, but the actual Lutherans that didn't break with Lutheranism following either the Prussian Union or the controversy in the 1970s following the split between fundamentalism and liberalism. So we, an issue with the confessional Lutherans and working with other people is that you will very quickly get into the problem of ecumenicism. That is, a lot of Lutheranism is hinged around not being another group. And that's been one of the main issues with it historically, is that it gets lumped in with something. So you're going to have a lot of clarification to do if you are to work with them, and it's not unfruitful to work with them. You're going to have a lot of clarification to do around what you mean with the one banner and all of that, because you're going to have to assuage fears that you're trying to work on an ecumenical movement. That's kind of like, that's issue number one. And just to make sure that we're clear as well, we aren't we aren't some schismatics waiting to break with people if they are the wrong doctrine, which is something that you might an idea about us that you might get if you listen to the Roman Catholic side of history, that the Lutherans will break a church if it so much as deviates slightly from whatever the main Lutheran thinks at the time, because if you remember correctly, we didn't split necessarily, we were kicked out. It's a lot of history to explain, So I don't know how good of a job I can do in 5 minutes of what is confessional Lutheranism. To summarize it into 2 words, though, you might call it evangelical Catholic, Roman Catholic, the evangelical side of that, trying to bring it back to its original roots in the early church. I don't know what more to add, and that's just because it's a lot to cover.
So we can gloss you in your own words as evangelical Lutheran.
Yes, that's technically what it is. Though if you say evangelical Lutheran, then if you go Google that, you're going to find the liberal Lutherans. Confessional might be a better one.
Forgive me then. Yes, confessional Lutheran, which can be rephrased as an evangelical Catholic. Forgive me.
Yes, there you go.
All right, fair enough. And Ferro, you, sir.
Good evening. Yes, I am a practicing Anglican. Now, my background is I've been to a wide variety of churches, from Church of England to I've been to a few Baptist churches in my time. My great grandfather was a roving Methodist preacher, traveling from town to town, and my great aunt was a Catholic nun. So we have many different strains of Christianity in the family, and so it's fitting that I am currently going to the denomination that is a hodgepodge of everything. That is Anglicanism. We believe whatever the current monarch tells us to believe. I'm only joking, really. There's some definite rules in place, but I think there's a very interesting background to Anglicanism, and also my viewpoint on a lot of theology is the importance of power in the way that religion is created. And again, I think that's something that Anglicanism is quite frank about, which other denominations aren't necessarily so frank. But I'll keep
part of its birthing pangs. No.
Yes, yeah. Like again, I think there's an interesting argument to say that all denominations are a consequence of power in some ways, but I don't want to. I think it's another topic. For another stream,
about to start a fight, right?
No, I want to keep to the stream topic. So there we go. That's me.
That's excellent, and thank you, Ferro. And so that we don't have to do this when Patriarch appears, as I hope he will, he is, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, he is Orthodox. Is there any more specific flavor of that to your knowledge? Anyone?
I think he's Eastern Orthodox, but I might be wrong. I feel bad if I get that incorrect. Also,
right. Then we'll have to let him speak for himself when he comes in.
Yeah, that's probably best. One comment on the denominations that I wanted to say, and there's been people in chat saying there's a lot of jargon and things to take on board here. That is true. And my general feeling about the whole denominations issue is that there has been a lot of wasted energy and time throughout history of Christians squabbling amongst themselves over things that, if you take a step back, aren't actually as important as they seem. So I, for example, on my channel, welcome people of all denominations. I don't think the denominations aren't important, but for people from the outside of Christianity looking in, or just finding out about it, don't feel these are the key things to figure out. I very much think of the historic details of how these denominations came about and what they each believe is quite complicated and quite secondary, really. But it is pertinent to this stream to talk about a bit. So,
and in any case, we're not going to be able to resolve the centuries or even millennia worth of, well, not quite millennia at this point, but almost. We're not going to be able to resolve centuries worth of disagreement.
Frustratingly schismatic infighting is a problem that people within the dissident right will be familiar with, I think.
Yes, and we see it reflected even in this domain. Well, let's come around to the central question, if we may. Thank you all. I guess the best way to say this is, do any of you see a reason why we should first address the question of preserving and protecting the national traditions of white peoples first, or the idea of responding constructively to all the anti-white behavior and activities? You know, I could sort of throw it up either way, but I thought perhaps one or the other of you might have some view that it would be more prudent to approach one of those first.
Well, one of the things, the reasons why it will concern the Christians to defend specifically some of the white traditions is that a lot of our beliefs end up getting lumped in with that. So what you see with the anti-white attacks is often a very anti-Christian bent to it. And that is because they've recognized that that for most of white history, there is going to be a very strong correlation with Christianity, and then being as they're anti-white, they're going to be anti-Christianity as well. So this topic does not just bypass us in any way.
Well, then perhaps let's do it this way, and then and just a second, I'll welcome Mr. Patriarch. Perhaps let's do it this way. Let's treat those questions as intertwined, and instead of trying to break them out separately, because I believe they do overlap to a certain extent. Mr. Patriarch coming in, just joining us now. Since you didn't catch this at the opening, I was saying that because we have a hard stop in about an hour and a half from now, we're going to focus on two questions: the whole business of constructively responding to anti-white behavior, and the promotion of anti-white ideas, and preserving and protecting national traditions of white peoples in the plural. So I guess you're arriving at this point. We're about to tackle these two interrelated questions, which I guess we'll treat as one. But welcome, Mr. Patriarch. Glad you could join us. The other folks have already indicated what their denomination is, and so we thought it best that you should share your own similarly.
Yes. Thanks for having me on, Samika. Happy to be here. Apologies for the late arrival. I was at a barbecue, or a braai as they call it in South Africa, with some friends, and then on my way back, everything was going good, and then there was a traffic accident on the highway, and that sort of blocked up everything sort of on the way here. So that explains my late arrival. So apologies. But my personal background, I was raised in kind of a nominally Christian home. After my uncle died, my family began to sort of take Christianity more seriously, and I guess you could term my denominational upbringing as evangelical. It's kind of normie American Christian, I guess. But then after once I sort of as many people do in their 20s, they kind of go off the rails a little bit. That was me. Not too much off the rails, but when I came back to the Lord, I remembered a friend of mine who left a strong impression on me, who was an Orthodox Christian. And in the state I come from, there's quite a few Orthodox Christians, and they're always on my radar, but I didn't know much about them. And then being a student of history and whatnot, I studied sort of the early church history and whatnot. And for historical reasons and reasons of faith and personal witness of my friend, I kind of became an Orthodox Christian. So that's sort of my Christian denominational my current transition from evangelical. That is my Christian denomination today. I am an Orthodox Christian. There's a lot of confusion in the United States. The idea, you'll hear there's Greek Orthodox, there's Russian Orthodox, there's Serbian Orthodox, there's Antiochian Orthodox. But really, they're all in communion. They're all one church. The different labels denominations just basically differentiates nationality. So, for example, the Greek Orthodox Church will have their own sort of patriarch. The Russian Orthodox have a patriarch in Moscow. And a patriarch is just basically a bishop who's first among equals. There's no pope of the Orthodox Church, unlike Roman Catholicism. And the church functions synodally. And there will be variation in language amongst the different Orthodox churches. But really, it's all the same faith. And they're all in communion with each other. So if you are an Antiochian Orthodox Christian in America, and you go to Greece, to Mount Athos, to talk to some of the monks there, and you want to take communion there, you will be accepted. You are within communion with them. So it's all one church. But hopefully that gives some context.
Excellent. It does. And thank you. Well, then let's open with this sort of basic question. Remember that this is within the context of eventually, I want to ensure that everybody is keeping the end goal for the series in mind, which is the development of fundamental themes, a fundamental story, fundamental issues that many different groups that could potentially cooperate within the so-called dissident right, could all accept. And so the Christians are in their various denominations, despite a settler's lament coming in and saying that he will tolerate no heresy. The various Christian denominations themselves comprise a whole in some fashion that is a resource potentially for the dissident right. And the key issues that are of concern to me in this strategy series are the idea of all the anti-white crap going on, and the destruction of nations and their cultures. And so let's sort of open with that. I'd say whomever it is that whoever wants to start, let's look at the idea of perhaps anti-white and the nations as well, and whether or not Christians can get on board with that idea. Perhaps how they see it. Is it something that they're allowed to be concerned about? If so, how does that fit within doctrine? What resistance do they have to being cognizant of it and caring? These sorts of things. Sorry, Lambda.
I was going to say I have a comment on this. I think there is an attack often made by the non-Christian elements on the right that Christianity has caused some of these problems that you're talking about. And I think the correct way to think about it is that a lot of the woke and progressive ideas are twists on Christianity. There is this seed of truth that essentially progressivism is, think of it as a heretical form of Christianity. So it's the West having a strong Christian base. When it goes awry, the beliefs you can see the seeds within Christianity, and therefore the correct way to think about it, the response is that those Christians who care about biblical truth should unite against these incorrect understandings of the Bible. So to be specific, there's a passage, for example, in Galatians that says, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female. So you can see how this verse can be taken to mean, let's abolish ethnicities and nationalities, let's abolish slavery, and let's abolish male and female, and you get into some of these other issues as well. But I think any serious-minded theologian will recognize that it's a misuse of this passage to think that it's saying, whilst we're still here on earth currently living, these distinctions don't exist and don't matter. And in fact, in history, the white people groups that you're describing have been some of the most powerfully used for spreading Christianity around the world, although it's not right to say that it is a white religion, but nonetheless, some of the anti-white attacks come laden with an anti-Christian core. So I guess that's my opening salvo. That there is a misunderstanding some people have that the Christians and I think the Protestants in particular, even more so than other sects, are held as being responsible for what's gone wrong, and therefore people want to throw out Christianity from the allegiance because they're kind of part of the problem, and that
throw out baby Jesus with the bathwater.
Exactly, and it would be much better to say we who aren't Christians agree with the hardcore Christians who really take Scripture seriously, and we both want to see a reversal of some of these progressive social changes.
But can there be a desire to see a reversal based upon the issue of it being anti-white, or does it because Turnip brought this up as well, that there is an overlap between the anti-Christian and the anti-white. So would the Christian be forced, due to the universal tenets of the faith, which are quite real, would that Christian be forced only to push back against something that is anti-white insofar as it is anti-Christian? Is there even room within Christianity to take exception to the idea of anti-white at all?
Yeah, no,
yes.
Just coming in here a second, I think there's a few interesting things for me, and I think you have to think about biblical understandings of the nations and people. And obviously, just one thing I want to bring up is the story of the Tower of Babel, where again, for those who haven't heard of it, it's obviously quite a famous passage from Genesis, where at that time all the peoples of the earth spoke one language or one people, and they basically created this tower so they could, almost reach the heavens themselves. This idea of a unified peoples think they can be better than God, and God changed their language and scattered them to the winds of the earth. So I think there's an interesting, almost kind of like foundation to the idea of different groups and peoples, and this idea of us all being joined together, having a quite negative precedent right from the start. Now, moving on a little bit to your point, Semiagog, about is there any way through Scripture you could argue to try and take down anti-white rhetoric? I think there is, but probably through understandings of the natural law and discussions around family. And again, I think it depends how you think about the nation, the nationhood, etc. But I think if you can frame it in the understanding of family, so for example, I'm an Englishman. In some ways, every Englishman is a family member, although very, very distant. Obviously, Semiagog, with are you like a 16th English or whatever? You are a most distant relation.
A 16th, more like an eighth.
Okay. But because there's some interesting Bible verses around the importance to maintain and to keep the family, and to place it in preference of other people. Because again, I think a lot of the question goes down to do English people have the right to actively discriminate and to look after themselves at the expense of someone else? And I think if you can frame it as I, as an Englishman, am related to all other Englishmen by blood, I have the right to look after them in a better way than anyone else in the world because of that connection, basically. So I think I don't want to talk too much and let the other guys speak as well, but that's one angle I think that's interesting.
I think it's very interesting. I just throw in there very briefly that you have sort of two themes that I've identified. Now, I'm not particularly knowledgeable about Christianity, but I'm not entirely ignorant either, and I've even dipped my toes rather deep into some of the aspects of the mysticism. But it seems to me that there are two sort of themes. One comes out of the sort of Judaic traditions that are very concerned with bloodlines. So if you take a look, for example, at the Book of Numbers, it's just like one long, endless recitation of who is related to whom and how. So there's a concern there. There's also very specific biblical terminology along the lines of, a vine out of Egypt, the idea of a vine, a plant that is growing, and it can be related to a bloodline. And I may be messing that up in terms specifically of Egypt, but as I recall, there's a very beautiful metaphor that is the vine that grows out of this place and represents this people. And so that is sort of something that gets carried over from Judaism. And of course, there are many elements of that, the Old Testament being what it is, not to say that the New Testament and the Revelation, the idea of in me, the laws are fulfilled. That's a very real thing too. So I'm not discounting it. On the other hand, you have the idea of render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and the idea that Christians, certainly when you look at people in the past saying that, the domain of law and empire and the secular, in the Catholic religion, you have the tradition of the secular law and the religious law. Giordano Bruno was, eventually turned over to secular authorities after having been tried by religious ones, or I can't remember all the details at present, but you get the point. There is the idea that arguably there are traditions where the secular law is its own domain. And you could even go so far as to say that many of the problems with the flattened materialistic pseudo Christian aspects that have survived, you could argue that many of those exist because of a movement of the spiritual into the realm of the political at the expense of the spiritual. Which you could at least argue is a result of these of the Christians stepping into a domain that for a long time had traditionally been kept distinct, if not entirely independent. So, sorry, others?
Yeah, the one thing that I would add is kind of an addendum onto what Lambda said, which was that there's a lot of talk on the internet about Christianity or progressivism being kind of a rooted in sort of Christianity. But I think that puts too broad a point on it. What it really is it's a godless post-Christian heresy, I think is the correct way to look at it. And if we look at different religions throughout history, in China with the Taiping Rebellion and the what was it? It was the Holy Kingdom or whatever. Or if we look at in Judaism with the nation of Israel and how the tribes fell into idolatry and whatnot, and you'd have certain ascendancy, heretical faiths at one time or another. And then the nation of Israel would fall under judgment sometime after that. I don't think this is particularly anything new. The thing is that what we're seeing in the West today is that we have reached such a level of relative power and affluence so that the effect of these heresies having ascendancy is now much greater than before. Okay. And also a lot of people will pin sort of the universality of Christianity as kind of being a problem. But if you look at Islam, for example, Islam is another universalist religion. Islam is very big on propagating itself. It's very big on having people of different faiths, races, ethnicities within the fold. So you'll have Muslims in Ethiopia, Muslims in Indonesia, and Muslims in Saudi Arabia. In Chechnya, you have white, African, Asian, and Muslims, but they don't have the problems that we have sort of in the West today. And I would postulate that is because they've basically not been targeted to the same extent that Christianity has, right? So Christianity is the source of so much progress in society in terms of material progress, intellectual progress, scientific progress, and so on and so forth, so that it was the first to basically be subject to the pause, if that sort of makes sense. Now, if we sort of look at kind of the defense of the nations within Christianity, we see that not only within the New Testament, but also in the Old Testament. So, for example, there's a famous passage in the Bible where I believe it was a Greek woman approached Jesus, and she wanted basically what, Jesus was offering, essentially. And Jesus basically said, now is the time to sort of offer this to Israel, not sort of throw it before the dogs. And the Greek woman's response was essentially, but, Master, even the dogs should eat from the crumbs from the table, meaning that, yes, we recognize that the Jews are sort of a separate people, but at the same time, salvation is for all. And Jesus recognized this and commented on the woman's faith. We also see in the book of Revelations that the nations are all present during the last days. So if the nations are all present during the last days, that means there is no globo homo, essentially. It means we have not erased what makes people groups distinct from one another, right? So God made the nations, and it is supposed if you sort of look at the book of Revelation, that the nations perpetuate until the end. And as such, it is within God's law and accordance that they should not only exist, but to try and destroy them is to sort of raise your hand against what God has made, right?
Coming back to the sort of Tower of Babel example that Ferro gave us.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of going back to the example of that Ferro gave us. And if we sort of look at church history as well, we see this idea of Symphonia in the Orthodox Church, sort of the harmony between temporal authority, which is, the king who serves in for the good of his people, right, to protect them from heathen invaders and whatnot, and also the church. So there's a harmony between temporal authority and spiritual authority. And there's also great saints within the Orthodox Church as well. There's like Serbian kings who are sainted for their miraculous victories over like Muslim invaders and whatnot. So you can extrapolate from that, obviously that the implicit virtue that these kings, these saintly kings, were exhibiting was protection and defense of their people and their nation and their land. That would apply to, whites just as well, wherever they may be. So English, French, Germans, Americans, etc. So I guess that would be kind of my response to that.
It certainly seems to me, just looking at it in general terms, that the Eastern Christian Church, or churches, we'll call it church, since you've indicated that it is bound together, certainly, Armenian, Greek, Orthodox, all those things being related. And again, there's probably aspects of this where I'm screwing up and someone will come in and say, well, now these are distinct, but, granting that, we can manifestly see that in the East, the Christian churches or church certainly does seem to have a better track record with cleaving to nationalism, even to the present day. Whereas, the universalism, Catholic, of course, meaning universal, let's at least say that has served to facilitate the subversion of the Catholic Church in any number of respects. And I'm not saying that the other churches haven't gotten it as well. I don't know how many I drive past as I go around town that have, Black Lives Matter banners outside of them and all the rest. But it does seem that in the East, they've been able to maintain those traditions of recognizing the nation and not feeling, not being debilitated by guilt, in terms of their defending them. But here I am not being terse again. A turnip. What are your thoughts, sir?
Well, so with the idea of a nation, you have quite a lot of Lutheran practice that came out of the Reformation that would be very beneficial towards this idea, that doesn't necessarily have a place in theology, because something that you will see with Lutherans quite a lot is that you divide responsibilities up into different spheres, the church, the sphere of the church, the sphere of the state, and things along those lines, with a recognition that there are things that the state will do that it is best at. The state being any temporal leadership. So not necessarily in the modern idea of the state as some giant bureaucracy with some capital city that's working with Globo Homo, but rather, your local leader, king, the nobility, whoever is supposed to be your temporal leader. So with that knowledge, with that foundation, it is very easy to see that the idea of a nation can combine very well with Lutheranism, or with any Christianity for that matter, just because there are some things that the nation will be subservient to, just in the temporal sphere. You don't need to tie everything back to theology, because theology gives way, or rather allows these things to happen. You don't need to have a priest ordaining everything as it goes along, if that made any sense.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's drawing out the distinction between the church and state, that's
right.
Commemorated.
Not separating them necessarily, just saying that they are supposed to do different things.
Right, and they're distinct, whereas distinct, but indeed not independent.
Right.
Ultimately, and that the spiritual is dominant over the temporal, just as a matter of ontology. I mean, that's just how it is. And whereas you see, for example, with things like halakha or sharia, that the religious law is a part of the scripture, derives from the scripture, and was encoded shortly thereafter. And so there is no equivalent notion of the distinction between church and state, to whatever extent it manifests, in the traditional Jewish or Muslim scripture, at least
right.
not that I'm aware of.
And going back to I mentioned the Reformation earlier, because what happened was, at least in the German states, you had a mass resistance of the clergy to the Reformation. So what do we do now? Well, we just organize along our national lines, and this is the church now. The evangelical church in Mecklenburg, Holstein, what have you. Prussia was one. You can do all that, or if the clergy goes along, you get your state churches like you have in Scandinavia. Just as an example of nationalism and Christianity, working in one path. You keep the nation, you keep all of its customs and all that, and you keep the Christianity. They aren't necessarily opposed to each other, and oftentimes they work with each other.
And certainly historically have worked together, and therefore we can determine that they can work together. And
yes.
we've heard, with the example of the Tower of Babel, or the way in which the Eastern churches have managed to maintain their nationalist frames. We see that this can happen, and has happened, and in some cases still does happen. So the protection of the nations and their culture part of the question, it seems like there's, it's not too depressing a picture. That has been functional in the past, could be functional again. Leaving aside the question of active subversion, the installing of various mouthpieces to pervert the message, or to water it down, or subvert it in whatever fashion. But let's come back around, since to this idea specifically of the anti-white issues. So each of you are involved with your respective churches, so far as I understand it. So if you were to be talking with people on Sunday after church, you know, if you all get together and you're hanging out and you happen to raise the issue of all the anti-white agitation with members of your church, what's likely to transpire? How are they likely to respond? What is the condition of your fellow believers, or as regards their attitudes to this issue? So here I'm specifically going after the idea of how are they looking at it now? How do they respond to it? What is the sort of status quo in the various churches at this point relative to this question? How would they respond? And therefore, we could see whether or not we could see if they have a resistance to even recognizing that, and if so, on what basis.
Shall I go first? My experience has been I have a close group of male friends in my church who we actually all have similar views, as in we consider a lot of the messaging around race to be extremely, well, frankly, evil, anti-Christian perspectives. So we are a subset of the church, which I'd say has quite a based opinion on this topic. However, I would be very careful about voicing any of these concerns with people I don't know well, because I'm aware in the church there is lots of people who are buying the media's perspective hook, line, and sinker, including for example, when the Black Lives Matter protests were happening, we got sermons about we have to consider whether we are, you know, do we have internalized racism and so on. My view is that as Christians, our fundamental identity is being in Christ, whereas what we're being pushed to do is consider our fundamental identity to be your white, straight, male, these characteristics, and therefore you find yourself somewhere in a hierarchy of privilege. In my view, there are elements of the right who want to consider their identity to be that they're white and that they are nationalistic and so on. And in a sense, that's where we may not get along. In that I don't think I can consider my primary identity to be white, regardless of if I view that as being a positive, rah rah go white people, or on the other hand, a self-flagellating, apologetic kind of identity as a white person. I think there's errors on both sides, but certainly a lot of the anti-white sentiments, I do find there are underground, quite bashful groups such as my own, which are a little afraid to raise their head above the parapets, but who do see problems in what's going on.
Can I just jump in there with Andrew again? Sorry, just that there's some really interesting stuff around that identification as, like, you know, Christian first, and in my view, it's kind of like we have you know, we're citizens to the heavenly kingdom and we're citizens to the earthly kingdom at the same time. In my mind, it's not that one comes before the other. It's kind of like they're not mutually exclusive, as it were, and in their mind they're fused together. Because again, from the Protestant viewpoint, the heavenly kingdom is not a physical manifestation. And again, this is an interesting theological point where the Catholics would differentiate themselves and say that the heavenly kingdom is a physical place, and so you have a passport to a specific place on the earth. So in my mind, I don't think it's not saying I'm placing Christianity above my Englishness. It's that I'm an English Christian if that makes sense. It's like one thing talks about my physical body and who I am, and one talks about my connection to God and heaven itself. But also, like, I think you need to realize, especially in England, to even talk about the way that I described it, to discriminate positively towards the English over someone else. I'm pretty sure, like, legally, that's a crime in England, basically. So you need to understand that even from the start, the laws of the land are set in a way against us where that we would not be able to actively support that. I think. Sorry, did you want to?
Well, but finish your thought, please.
Yeah. Sorry, and I think, to Lambda's point, when you speak to people about, if you were to say, should English culture be allowed to exist? Should an Englishman be allowed to choose, how he wants to live? Should he be able to live in a homogenous society if he wants to? Most people would agree with that. However, and I think this is an interesting point around the church. I feel like race is one of the big weaknesses to the church. So again, the kind of the church I go to is heavily connected to, for example, like anti-LGBTQ nonsense stuff. Like that, they are like involved in circles that, again, they say stuff that is basically illegal in the country, and they're happy to kind of put their head above the pulpit and say don't believe in gay marriage, gay culture is a terrible thing. But if you go into this topic, I think because of I don't know why, but I think that there is a much more softer approach towards that, and I'm not quite sure what it is. I mean, certainly from an Anglicanism point of view, I mean, AM sent a video around of the Queen's speech in the private chat a while ago. I don't know if you saw that, Semiagog, but obviously the Queen is the head of the Church of England, and I've got it saved to the exact time point. I don't know how much time we have, but she basically I'll maybe send it around later, but she basically says that we should treat everyone equally, etc. So just from a pure Anglicanism point of view, the push from above is in a certain direction. However, I think there is like a push from below, and the common sense and the logic of the people is a different flow.
Yeah, and
that's your. Sorry, but just very quickly, that's your top-down, bottom-up distinction. So I've seen that quite a bit. One of my friends has done a great deal of research into lay brotherhoods in the Catholic Church, and there is the sort of top-down arrangement of the princes of the church and the hierarchy and the ordering, but there is a very, very strong and very heterogeneous set of traditions, a huge variety of them, of the lay brotherhoods in each of their specific regions, who worship in their specific way with their own festivals and holy days and their own saints, regionally associated with their regions and all the rest. And for those who are not aware of it, presumably all are, but just in case, when Ferro mentions the Queen saying what she did, she is, as I understand it, she is the head of the Anglican Church, is she not?
Yes, and I mean, she doesn't have that much sway, but I mean, I would say that she is a Christian, and she's a well-respected figure. I know, for example, my old vicar had a calendar of the Queen in his office. She is very, very well respected, and what she says, this is an interesting feature of the kind of so-called national churches. We will always be a reflection of the monarch of the times, and that's why if you go to the Church of Sweden, they have a transgender man doing gay ceremonies, etc. We're only as good as our leadership is ultimately.
Yes, the rainbow dildo crozier. Yes, that seems to be very much in in fashion these days. It just seems strange to me that Christianity was, as many people have observed in terms of the splintering of the various Protestant sects and their millenarian or millennialist or whatever the hell you would call it, tendencies, and their desire to engage in all sorts of utopian experiments, which just flowered all across the United States. It's so strange that that tendency was present in Christianity for some time, and now it seems to be so dead. I'm not sure I'm saying this right. How do I get this out? Basically, they were so willing to say no to various types of authority and to go their own route based on the idea of the conscience, right, and the individual relationship with Christ, and to boldly do it at risk to themselves. And yet those same elements, or at least the churches that I'm hearing about today, perhaps not so much in the East, they seem to have entirely succumbed and rolled over. Like I can't imagine a Blake appearing, whether you agree with his theology or his politics or his attitude towards sexuality or whatever. Like today, could you imagine a Blake appearing? They just all seem so, no offense, gentlemen, I'm not speaking about you or your specific faiths, but there's any number of putative Christians who just are so gutless.
If I may, I'm glad that you brought up the utopian experiments that were particularly prominent here, because a lot of the utopian ones specifically happened in the early 1800s, right? That's when you get a lot of that's when you specifically get a lot of utopian explicit experiments.
And in the Northeast as well.
Yes, yeah. This is the same time that you get Soren Kierkegaard writing against the state churches back in Europe, claiming that they've completely lost their ways, they've become completely materialistic, and that the identity of Christian is worthless in the 1800s. So those utopian experiments were not the majority at all, and were in fact a staunch minority. And we've got writers at the time that are basically just saying the label of Christian is useless. And you can see that, and you can see this today. If I'm in the American South and someone calls themselves a Christian, it's just a cultural label. And all of the only people fighting back against it, fighting back against some sort of global homogenous system, is a very small minority of the church. It's the exact same thing, and it's probably been this way for a lot longer than early 1800. It's just that we have a way of looking back at the past, seeing that the majority of people weren't as bad as the majority are today, and thinking, well, then everyone must have been as good as these few people that we see over here in the Northeast.
Right, and the Bible teaches us indeed that there's nothing new under the sun. So,
right,
yeah, and that is a sentiment I very much agree with.
And if I may, Ferro pointed out something that's just true throughout most of Christianity, and that was the idea that the higher ups have a completely different way of viewing the world and doing things than the people sitting in the actual pews, which has just been true for most of Christian history. And varying in different places. It's not uniform, but you can see that the original question basically was, how do congregations respond to anti-white agitation? With my side of this whole thing, the people in the sort of the clergy, if you will, actually they are with the congregation, and that they are against it, but they go after different things. The congregation being the average person, all of that. I was actually quite proud to see it. The Lutherans were against things specifically naming like the Frankfurt School and critical race theory and all that. The congregation, the normal people, a few years ago, before it hit the major news cycles, and the priests and the pastors, rather, the clergy, the seminarians, have been going against a lot of the metaphysical foundation of it as well. In fact, a lot of the conclusions that this side reached were that this side has reached in terms of policy and ideas in the past few years. I was originally hearing it talked about by a few of the pastors in my area, and it's one of the reasons that I am so happy to keep with the tradition and all of that, is because the people have managed to reach the conclusions that I find to be correct way before I or any of the people here started talking about it as a major issue, which is, I don't know how uniformly distributed that is across the rest of the denominations, but it's given me quite a lot of hope.
Can I respond to something going on in the chat, which is people making some very boring accusations that the church is a useless force and it's been unable to defeat the progressive forces, etc.
Deeply subversive AA. Yes.
AA. So this is at you. There are two different things we might mean by church. One is the individuals that are being put forwards as representing churches, and as the criticisms of many of these people are very justified, and I share your horror at their capitulation. However, we must be very careful not to misapply these attacks against the church, meaning God's actual army on earth, the people who are real Christians, this is a force you should never discount, that will last forever. A good way to think about this is the fact that God prophesied Jesus would come through a lineage from Abraham, and there was a whole series of moments at which it looked like God's plan was going to fail. We saw they couldn't have children. Joseph ended up in prison, and then he ended up ruling over Egypt. You see all the prophets again and again saying the nation of Israel is a complete disaster, catastrophe, and embarrassment. They're not living the way that they should, and it looks like the devil's won. The plan of God has failed, and yet Jesus was born. And then what happens to Jesus? He ends up on a cross dead. How is that political power? And then here we are 2,000 years later, and there's more Christians on the planet than any other religion. So let's not forget that in the ultimate evaluation, Christianity is the most powerful force on the planet. Now, within our scope of the West, we've de-Christianized recently, and we see things falling apart as a result. And indeed, many of the organizations that used to be genuinely Christian have now been taken over by secular forces and are no longer representing real biblical perspectives. But let's not discount that the ability of Christianity on the world stage to continue to be a force for actual, genuine, traditional good is undefeatable.
And you have people saying the church has lost. Sorry.
Well, but just very quickly, there's the idea of the tradition of obedience, and that is a Christian tradition within the church to the authorities and the hierarchy. That's why you have things like bishops. Whether you have a particular bishop with his, sticking up higher than the rest in Rome or whatever, there is the idea of a tradition of obedience, and so there is the question of what do you do in a situation where you have a tradition of obedience, and it's a core aspect of Christianity, with the ecclesia and the rest, and Christ, and yet a change needs to be made because the organ of Christianity, or I should say the mechanism of it, the church itself. I'm screwing this all up. I clearly sound like someone who doesn't know much about Christianity. I'm butchering all of this, but hopefully you're taking my point. If you have a tradition of obedience, and yet the church is giving you problems because it's been subverted, then how traditional can you be stepping outside the tradition of obedience? And yet you're stuck with a kind of a catch-22, because, as has been pointed out, that Charlemagne was just saying, we need to get to the meat here. Hierarchical churches have been subverted, academic agents saying, Christians in name only. What does one do there? Particularly in a case, it's not a big problem for a Lutheran or a Baptist or an evangelical, because, or possibly even an Anglican, because they're like, well, just change who's in charge, right? But what if somebody's a Catholic or Orthodox? What room is there to do anything about this state of affairs?
If they're Catholic, then that sounds like a Catholic problem.
Yeah, but let me go ahead and let Mr. Patriarch come in, because also we did not hear from him about how his congregation might respond to raising anti-white issues. So if perhaps he could cover that and then be the first off responding to this latest bit.
I'm always eager to hear Turnip's jabs at the papacy. But sorry. Did a lot of drinking and cigarette smoking and whatnot at this barbecue I came from. Anyways, so with my specific congregation that I attend, both here in South Africa and back home, they would be, well, especially back where I come from, they would be what is called, based, very conservative congregation. I remember there was a guy who assists with the church who was not part of the clergy, but a layman who assists with services, who was mentioning something about basically how mass immigration is a problem, like literally, and how South Africans, this was when I was moving, and how South Africans kind of respect the idea of like ethnicity and whatnot. And I was like, oh, that's pretty based. So in my specific church, that's not much of an issue. And it's important to also note that in Orthodoxy and in Orthodox communities, thinking in terms of a racial lens is really kind of a Western thing. They don't really think in terms of race. They think in terms of ethnicity, people groups. People groups who are definable by language, culture, and religion. Race to them is much more of a broad. It's like saying, a Somali and a Zulu, right? They're black, but they're not the same religion. They're not the same ethnicity. They don't even look exactly the same. So the Orthodox Church in this regard is much more sort of granular in the way they look at it. Now, the church as a whole, I would say, my congregations aside, and also the church I attend here, there's a definite strong in-group ethnic Greek preference for the church that I attend, and they welcome outsiders to the congregation. We have some Congolese guys who were brought over. They were actually they had mission work done in the Congo, and they became Orthodox Christians. And when they moved to South Africa and to Cape Town, they wanted to become part of the church. So they were accepted into the church, but it's sort of understand that this is sort of our church. This is sort of the way we're doing things, and you're kind of, you're welcome here. You partake in the sacraments, and we're happy to have you. But this is kind of a Greek church. Now, the church as a whole is in sort of an interesting position, because what the kind of issue with sort of like anti-white, if you want to call it that, is that churches which are sort of have less influence from Western institutions, namely less money, less influence of Western money, because what ends up happening is that, and this is a well-known fact, that people like David Rockefeller and globalists and proto-globalists, they funded seminaries in Western countries specifically for the very thing that we're seeing today, for ecumenism, to bring everyone together. Though there's no differences between your denominations, let's sort of downplay the truth that you guys believe in and sort of get everyone on page. We're going to use the church for politics, which is obviously a big issue. And so when you have a church which is used to doing politics first and not fulfilling their spiritual mandate here on earth, then you get into problems.
And is there a mechanism? Is there a mechanism? Sorry, just to get to the thing of the obedience issue, are there mechanisms within the Orthodox Church that do not require you to be a rebellious freak who splinters the body of Christ, so to speak, that allow you to address those issues?
Yeah. So in the Orthodox Church, it's important to understand that the church is, as it sees itself, it's a hospital for the soul. Right. So even though you'll very often find, clergy with based takes and whatnot, the church is not primarily a political instrument. It's a spiritual instrument. Now, in terms of dealing with the temporal world, the church has had martyrs who have died for the faith throughout history. And they died specifically because of disobedience. They died of disobedience to the emperor, who demanded of them certain things, or to Roman emperors who demanded of them certain things, to heathens who demanded of them certain things, which would compromise their faith. Now,
but are they martyrs? Are they martyrs if they respond to a similarly evil arrangement when it comes from within the church? This is also, I'm going to listen to this. I'm going to come back later and make my notes from it to add it to my whole strategy document. But this whole point of martyrdom is very interesting to me because I often write that the way that we've been trained today by the various, media mouths. It all comes down to the basic idea that the only acceptable response to attack is suicide. And that has some interesting parallels with martyrdom, leaving aside the shahid in Islam, which is often translated as martyr, but it isn't, because in that case, you can kill your enemies and die doing so and still be considered a martyr. Whereas in Christianity, more generally, it refers to a passive acceptance of one's fate in the act of bearing witness to Christ in the face of this injustice. And it seems I just want to stick a pin in this because this is another aspect of Christianity. The fundamental idea, or a fundamental idea, is that you can be a martyr and in your own destruction, in passively embracing, not fully passively because you are bearing witness. So that's an active role, I should say. But in allowing yourself to be destroyed in order to bear witness, it seems as though we have the seeds of permitting or accepting the coming destruction of different white groups, because a passive response in the face will show that we're proper Christians. Now, I'm not saying that that's viable or that's true or that's not a perversion, but it seems that's something I'm going to want to look into further, because the macro micro there, or the way in which that's been flattened and ported over, transposed over into this other realm to make us accept our destruction, is rather interesting.
It's a really good point. And sorry, because just there's some interesting stuff here from my perspective. Just because I think to be a true martyr, you must be someone who wants to live, and is having to sacrifice that for the sake of their beliefs. So, for example, like I think what you're describing there is someone who just wants to die, and I think you're right. Something like that is being that they're encouraging people to think like that, and I think you're right. If you heard, I don't want to, maybe I shouldn't say there are kind of films that have been released recently referencing this fact. I think Simagog, you kind of pulled into this, but I think you need to have that the will to live to be a true martyr. Do you know what I'm saying? Otherwise, it's not a real sacrifice at the same time. And if you look at the history of martyrdom, there are people who wanted to carry on their lives, they wanted to live as normal, but because their faith was more important, that's when they gave them up. So I think that's a key differentiation from what you're describing, which is people who have just lost the will to live. And again, I think I always think back to some of the first commandments to man, which is to go forth and to multiply, spread to the ends of the earth. We've got this. Christianity is a vital faith. It is encouraging people to grow, to have children, to have families at the same time, and to live as people. And you're right that there is this kind of marketing of martyrdom as this kind of like nihilistic. You're sacrificing your life for the greater good or whatever. But that's not, I think, the true biblical understanding of what that means.
Yeah, no, that's very important, Ferro. I think that there's a big difference between sort of the caricature of martyrdom, which is basically religious lunatics doing the ancient equivalent of suicide by cop, as opposed to refusing to bend the knee for something you believe in and dying for it. Right.
That's a very good point. And it is something hinges upon that way of being able to turn it the one way or the other. There's something very important that hinges on just that distinction you're talking about and that Ferro mentioned. So this is at any rate very, very helpful to me in terms of trying to parse it out.
Yeah. So basically, there's room for two kinds of and then I think the lives of the saints are illustrative in this, because you have saints who are ascetics, who give themselves over to the spiritual life, who die to self in the service of others. And then you also have, essentially Christian badasses like Saint Stefan of Serbia, who is one of these saints who, at a time when, and if you look at this sort of what you're talking about, Semigog, with sort of obedience and whatnot, obedience is kind of contingent on a number of things, right? So the way I think about it, and the way I think the church has always sort of thought about it, is that the place of the seat of authority is legitimate, but the holder of authority may not be legitimate, right? So, for example, you can have an evil ruler be brought upon a people, which I would say the United States is undergoing now, as sort of a chastisement for being a wicked people, right? Or Satan could be afflicting a kingdom with sort of a scourge of an enemy and whatnot. But then the Christian can be called to sort of, like I was saying, the ascetic lifestyle, dying to self. But there's also the possibility and the prayer for the Lord to rise up, mighty men of God, to sort of drive the heathen from the land and save the flock in the physical sense, right? So that the people, the kingdom shall not perish from the earth. And Saint Stephen of Serbia is sort of one such character, right? So a guy who God rose up to sort of defend the people. There's all sorts of Old Testament examples which people like to bring up. And a lot of sort of naysayers to Christianity will say, well, yeah, but Christianity is this cucked religion, conveniently ignoring everything pre-1950, right? When it was certainly not. It was a vital force. But the idea that, you just have to sort of take it from foreign powers is absolutely not the history of the church.
No, certainly not in the East specifically.
Nor
to
some
some
extent
extent
until relatively recently.
Right, with Western Crusades and the rest, but that's still sort of stepping around the issue of whether or not the office holder has been vitiated. So that's a good point about the office itself. That's why we call it a cathedral. A cathedral is a chair. That's like a chairperson. It's a symbol in our culture consistently of an office, because the seat remains, but the person who sits in it changes, much like a king with a throne, a bishop with a chair. But what do you do, just to come back to Charlemagne and AA's point, before we move on, what do you do about the vitiation of the office holders?
I wanted to... By office holders, I'm sorry, Semyog, but by office holders, do you mean office holders within the church or in temporal authority?
The church.
A whole point is within the church, specifically to AA and Charlemagne's point. Go on, Ryan.
Because I made a jab earlier and I felt bad because I didn't get to actually do anything constructive afterwards. So what do you do if the Pope or the Archbishop or just the bishop sometimes is the head of the church for some denominations? What do you do if they are captured by globo homo? If you know your church history, and some people don't, that's fine. This is not as bad as it gets. You can have popes that run brothels out of the palace in Rome, which that blatantly going against God, very wicked, very satanic. What do you do if you're a Catholic? And just a disclaimer: I'm not a Roman Catholic, so my final answers
Right.
always going to be is always going to be the papacy is wrong. But
wait. I just have to insert. None of you would be speaking so flippantly about this if Settlers Lament were here. You would all tighten up. And yes.
I think I've spoken worse to him to his face, which is bad on me. But the existence of a bad pope is not the reason why it is wrong, and you have to make that very clear distinction. It's one of the reasons, but it's not the reason, and that's why if you look throughout all the Reformation documents, they aren't saying, well, the Pope is bad, therefore. In fact, the 95 Theses were mostly a defense of the Pope against what Luther saw as being a very corrupt bureaucracy, if you will. So what do? You keep your faith, and you try to find like-minded believers, knowing that most of what actually happens in Rome or from the Archbishop or from wherever you are in America is not going to influence your doctrine, just what the church is doing here on earth in administrative capacities. You don't. They aren't changing your doctrine necessarily. You're just seeing the bureaucracy of Rome and the bureaucracy of the Rockefellers or whatever align. It's not. Yeah. It's not going to hurt the faith, and it's not the main criticism that we have of the office itself. So, it's not that big of a deal, though it is still very unfortunate that the Pope is, an agent of this.
Well, it's not going to hurt the faith, but it certainly seems to be hurting the faithful.
Yeah, no, yes. That's true.
That's the bad
one
thing.
The one thing I would say to this is that I think it's okay. So when we think about a hierarch within the church who's compromised, right? It's very seldom ever that the whole church is compromised at once, right? So if we look at history and today, that has never been the case. In the past, in Christianity, you had something called the Arian heresy, which was, no, it doesn't mean like Arian, like Sieg Heil Arian. It meant there was a priest named Arius who propagated a heresy that Jesus was sort of a created creature and not divine. And there was a time when most Christians and most Christian hierarchs believed this heresy. It was a very popular heresy. And so you were in the position with the Christian church where most Christians, unfortunately, sort of believed this heresy. So what ended up happening is you had an ecumenical council, sort of a synod of bishops, where they sort of hashed this out, and then they proclaimed sort of, emphatically that this is a heresy and that everyone should sort of repent or recant and whatever. So that's sort of one way to deal with it. The Orthodox Church has always dealt with these things synodally. So the Orthodox Church, in terms of its structure, it's more hierarchical than Protestant denominations, but less hierarchical than Catholicism. So the idea is that the structure and the hierarchy prevents heresies from being spread, but it's not so top heavy so that if the head is compromised, it infects the rest of the church. You can have infections in various branches of the church. That's true, and that's always been true, just like any organization. But you cannot corrupt the whole body of Christ, which is the argument of the Orthodox Church, right? And, Lutherans will also claim the same. So, for example, if you compare evangelical Lutherans to the evangelical Lutherans of America to Missouri Synod Lutherans in America, the Missouri Synod Lutherans are going to be much more based than the evangelical Lutherans. And that's because they are consciously trying to hold on to traditions and whatnot. And whereas the evangelical Lutherans are sort of more go along to get along, let's change with the times and whatnot. Now, in order to try and deal with these bishops, there's been all sorts of ways throughout history and today where people deal with them. So currently, there's bishops and patriarchs who are sort of more paused or whatever, and the other ones will just excommunicate them.
And they also have room to do things differently in their different domains because
Exactly.
the bishops have that equal authority. So it would seem that that leaves considerable room for variations in interpretation, not in terms of core doctrine, but each one can lead their flock as suits them. I mean, that sounds like what you're saying. If they can
to a
say
certain extent, so they cannot, of course, go against dogma. Otherwise, they would be anathematized and cast out of the church as heretics and
core
schismatics.
doctrine.
Yes, but for example, the Patriarch Bartholomew, who basically has a CIA behind him, has been sort of a little more friendly, not openly friendly, like some church members or some church heads that we might think of, but sort of low key friendly to sort of the party of Davos or whatever. And the Patriarch of Moscow basically excommunicated him. He's like, look, you're sort of like, what you're doing is anathema because of sort of on this specific issue. So there's checks and balances sort of within the church itself. And if we look at sort of the history of Christendom, the way this functions, sort of messy and whatnot, it's not always perfect, but you'll have, like, for example, St. John Chrysostom, who sort of wrote the Orthodox liturgy. He became the Bishop of Constantinople, and then he was exiled because he was calling out sort of the emperor at the time, and then he was reinstated, and then he was exiled again, and I believe he died in exile. And there's also been heretical bishops like Nestorius. Nestorius was the bishop of Constantinople at a later point, but essentially the church got together in sort of a synod, and then they determined, what Nestorius is saying is heretical, so we are removing him from his seat, and we're going to put in someone else there who is Orthodox.
So there are definitely a number of ways that it can be dealt with.
Absolutely.
And it sounds to me like there's more of a decent. There are more decentralized mechanisms than you might see. I'm not, Settlers Lament isn't here to chastise, so but it would seem that with the Cardinal College of Cardinals, that there's, let's just say that it's likely less decentralized. But let's come back around because we have less than 30 minutes left. I want to cut this sharply, as I said, because Apostolic Majesty has a great stream coming up that I would recommend everybody check out immediately following this one. Also, we may have our Catholic representative appearing at any moment, at which time we'll have to give him a little bit of a voice. And I will want, when he comes in, to focus on these same sort of the two halves of the question, how Christians might be able to cooperate with the dissident right in terms of dealing with the anti-white provocations and attacks and all the rest, and also this idea of the defensive nations and all. So I would turn it over to you guys. Just basically, there are probably many things that you've thought about in terms of these questions that I haven't brought up and that you haven't had a chance to say. So I'd turn it over to each of you to just sort of come in with whatever occurs to you with the time we have remaining, specifically on this question of Christians basically getting behind a banner that is not explicitly Christian in cooperation against this set of issues that we face.
May I?
Of course.
So I wanted to point out that this is not a new or a surprising or an unexpected problem. I think a lot of the hand-wringing going on is the idea that somehow the modern global globalist movement is so powerful, it's the first thing that's been able to unseat the church, and therefore the church is going suddenly drifting away from doctrine. But actually, even if you go back to what the Bible says to expect, we're fully in line with things that have been happening throughout history. I just wanted to put in a couple of verses to contextualize this. So one is in 2 Corinthians, for such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds. So there's a Bible verse literally saying we're going to expect people to pretend to be Christians, to have places of authority, and they're literally the servants of Satan, pretending to be dressed up in Christian robes. And the prediction is they're going to get exactly what they deserve for such despicable behavior. And then I wanted an Old Testament verse from Isaiah: for the nation and kingdom that will not serve you shall perish. Those nations shall be utterly laid waste. Well, I think what we're seeing is a previously Christianized empire that was flourishing because, to a large extent, it followed Christian ideas, and God rewarded that. It has decided to stop worshipping God, including a lot of the so-called churches. And what else do we see? All of the signs that it's like the end of the Roman Empire, things collapsing around us. So to a large degree, when we start to see persecution of Christians, I think we will see the end of nominalism, right? This idea of Christian in name only. People still clinging on to the idea of being a Christian will no longer be socially advantageous, and the people left will hold genuinely traditional Christian views at that point, I believe.
It's a good way to solve Kierkegaard's problem. Can I go next? Or is
Go, sir. Go, sir.
All right.
Let's go clockwise. Or yeah, there you go.
So just to bounce off of what Patriarch was talking about earlier, and how church hierarchies will deal with heresies and things along those lines. Very, very. I'll keep this short. American Lutheranism actually did split in the 1970s, and it was between its conservative and its liberal wings. Formerly, they were all together under what was called the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And what actually happened was we had one guy that was elected to kind of like the head of the synod. He collected videotapes, quotes, and witnesses of the liberal professors in the seminaries, brought it to them, demanded to know if they actually stood by what they said, and then later kicked them out. Some of them walked out. It was called the Seminex, and they split off or were kicked out. And then the conservative part of the synod stayed, and the liberal part went to form the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which are the ones with the rainbow flags. So
and the female priests.
Yep. Yes. And so that's within living memory for some people. And it's a very modern example of how a church will deal with, people that are actively trying to destroy it from the inside. And this isn't unique to us. This could happen in literally any of the other churches, so long as there's some person there with the will to do it. It's going to look a bit differently because obviously we're not all the same, but it is possible. And that was just something I wanted to touch on earlier. In regards to forming a grand defense or a grand narrative against the anti-whites, I think that it would be beneficial in the strategy to keep any sort of explicitly Christian undertones to a minimal. And I'm not saying that because I don't like Christian influence and things. I'm saying that because the more specific that you get, or the more that you put that towards the center, the more issues that you're inviting to for doctrinal conflict and other theological prohibitions against action. So
let me make sure I just understand you here, because this is very interesting. You're saying that if you're going to make a case to Christians about dealing with anti-white issues,
Yep.
then leaving aside the questions that would emerge within a group of believers who are of the same denomination, which will be considerable in their own right, because everybody has their own interpretations. You're saying if you're going to raise it as an issue, don't bother raising it as a Christian issue, because you're probably going to bring with it more difficulties than.
Yep. Just say that they are. If you need to get them on side as part of, like, if you need to appeal to their Christianity, just say that this anti-white rhetoric is anti-Christian, and try to be, and don't really go into too much detail there, because the more detail that you go into, the more conflict that you are inviting on the grounds of Christianity. The more you are limiting how much you can work together. The more that you are limiting how much action you can take. It would actually be. Yes.
So apologies. So are you basically telling me that your gut feeling is that Christians in general are not going to be responsive to anti-white specifically as a concern unless it is framed as anti-Christian?
That would be. I'm not saying that they wouldn't be if you go any other direction. I'm saying that that would be the one that would get the most payoff, just because it targets everyone. If you say, look, we have an anti-Christian force here, and you leave it at that, and that's what it is. You're not lying here. That's going to get the most people to rally around without having some sort of ecumenical issue or doctrinal conflict. And it's also going to be the way in which you can do the most sort of pushback, because it's anti-Christian. It needs to be destroyed. These are true. You're not lying. You're not bending the truth. And you're not creating a need for more commitment than you actually need. So you're not saying we need to pool all of our resources together and make some giant anti-Christian crusade. You're just saying we need to get everyone on side in a coherent narrative, and that's perfectly doable.
That seems pragmatic. It just concerns me because, if you want to have control over a demon. And I realize this is not the best way to frame it for a Christian panel, but the old lore is that you must know its name, if only to banish it. Now it can be the total capping name, which is Satan, the adversary. But basically, it seems to be a turning your face away from the fact.
Well, no, because
that whites are targeted, and whether they're Christian or not, they are targeted.
Here, so. Maybe I was being too vague there. It is anti-white, and you do need to tell that to him, but you don't need to go into too much more detail. Anti-white, logical bridge to anti-Christian, therefore it concerns them. The anti-white is how it's going about, what it specifically is, what it's founded in. Anti-Christian is, what it's doing, the actions. Therefore, it involves all of the Christians. Basically what I'm saying is, be as truthful as you can without getting into too much detail, and that's all that you need to do. And that's going to have the most payoff. It's going to cause the least amount of problems, and you don't have to dilute anything there, and you don't have to lie about it.
Yeah, it's pragmatic, but it's just a cunning Lutheran. Look at him, just sort of stepping around the central issues in order to present it. That suits him.
I think there's a very plausible sense in which what we see as anti-white is actually anti-Christian in disguise. Now, maybe people would disagree with my analysis on this, but I think if you're talking to Christians, you can make that case very persuasively. Why do they attack the patriarchy? What's the ultimate patriarch? Is Abraham. So Judaism and Christianity are right in the cross lines. Why do they attack white? Well, because what they really hate is the religion that was controlling their morality, that they don't want to fall beneath. So I don't think the deceptive thing. I really believe that a lot of the anti-white rhetoric is actually anti-Christianity in disguise.
And that's how they see it already.
I'd agree. It just concerns me because there is an aspect of just saying it, no longer hedging, no longer hemming, no longer hawing. Now, I realize many of you, or some of you, I don't know, may well disagree with me and believe that that there is no explicitly anti-white agenda. I happen to think there is, and so it's of concern to me. Now, that doesn't mean that I need to go and try and tell Christians to care about something that is not high up on their list of concerns. But that is the thing that I wished to understand most. Is whether or not there's any opportunity there to move forward with getting people united under one banner to say this particular thing, the anti-white aspect, must stop, and it must stop because it is anti-white. The Christian thing being secondary or whatever. But I want to give Ferro a chance to jump in here. Are you still with us, sir, or have we put you to sleep?
No, not at all. No, I think there's loads of interesting things I wanted to touch upon quickly, if I may. Firstly, just going all the way back to Charlemagne's point around what happens in the Anglican Church when you have a ruler that disagrees with its base. Well, if you want, I don't want to Fed post too hard right now, but if you look at the origins of the English Civil War, that it was fundamentally about disagreement in the church, and basically people wanting a more Presbyterian view, and while the king wanting a more Anglo-Catholic view. Now, I think that moment has gone, but there is that history of the use of power, basically.
Yes, the realization on the part of the people with new religious ideas that you could blow a cavalier straight out of the saddle with a matchlock ball. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Now, again, I don't know whether we live in that age and we have the people with the same ability or heart to do that. But there is that precedent. I think also Protestantism is interesting. Protestantism is interesting because it has this process of what I call kind of schismatic renewal. Now, while Anglicanism may have seemed the same, it has changed rapidly over time in response to basically schismatic non-denominations at different times. So, for example, when the Methodists first landed, they changed Anglicanism in a very, very positive way, I would say. But as time has gone on, Methodism is now a total joke and should be basically dismantled. What I see happening in our lifetime is the creation of a new schism in Protestantism for a radical form of Protestantism emerging again, holding several of those of the views that I think would align well. And I think there are a number of times that could happen. I think, for example, the Queen dying actually is ironically going to be one of those moments, because as Charles comes in, he's the new head of the church. One of his big things is that he is the defender of the faiths. How does the head of the Church of England work with a universalist at the top? How does there's also like a big thing about sexuality coming out, which is all to do with the gay marriage stuff. If the gay marriage stuff happens again, there'll be a huge schism in the Church of England, and again, it will be at that time where there is a large number of people who are organised, have a singular vision to create a new denomination, which is radical, powerful, and focused at the same time. So I think there are potential hopes in that regard. I just wanted to also come back to an earlier point as well around why aren't people doing anything about it? And I think this is really interesting. For example, you sort of alluded to like Tyndale and the kind of vernacular use of the Bible. You know, when in England, when they were first using the English Bible, if you were to kind of recite anything from the Bible in English, you would be killed. And so you would have these martyrs who would stand up and start reading out the Bible in English. But what I think those people suffering in those times were suffering from a very physical persecution. While when you with today, when you have an immigrant coming in, displacing and negatively affecting the livelihood of an Englishman, for example, that's not something you personally feel at an individual level. Combine that with a strong media complex, we are missing the physicality. However, I do believe that it has to come at some point. And again, if you see the history of South Africa, it begins with the psychology and this kind of displacement of people. But at that moment, there'll become a time of this physical attack against English people, and again, I think that will be the moment to rise. But I've seen the Distributist has just joined, so I will silence myself to give him a chance to speak.
Well, welcome, Dave. Unfortunately, we have about 10 minutes left because we have a hard stop with Apostolic Majesty starting a great stream here, though we are going to do a part 2 on this. We have not, however, had a Catholic voice here, so I'm sorry to say that I'm just going to hit you straight in the face with this without any prompting, but I have 2 questions for you, or a 2-part interrelated question. Do you think it's possible for people within the Catholic Church to unite with others who are concerned specifically about the issue of anti-white activities and behaviors and the promotion of anti-white ideologies? And further, in defense of different peoples of Europe and their nations? Or do you think that's a non-starter? Do you think there's any way that that can be done, that there's any common ground that can be found there?
Pardon me. Is my question now? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it is. Sorry, and again, sorry to hit you with this so fast. I just want to give you room to speak and weigh in.
Yeah, well, so the way this will work, and this is not just a Catholic thing. This is a general Christian thing. Opposition to anti-whiteness is just a rational extension of Christian principles, just like an opposition to anti-blackness would be. And so when it comes to this issue, I think that it's pretty clear that there'll be a space for this as long as it's phrased in a universal way and it makes a proper appeal to a universal good, which I think is, well, first of all, I think well-being of all people. And the second one is genuine diversity, which is having a variety of cultures doing different things, which is, I think, something that we've really lost in the modern world. We can't conceptualize diversity without homogenization. And I think that's an impoverishment of our understanding of diversity. And I think as long as we stick to those principles that are more ancient principles of Christian ethics, I don't see why there would be a problem at all.
If you were to sit down with members of your congregation when you're talking after church one day or having taken mass or whatever it is, and you're and you were to bring up the idea that there is a thing called, and I hate the term, frankly, anti-whiteism, it just seems barbarous, but no one has yet created a better way to gloss it, that I'm aware of anyway. And if you were to bring up the fact that there is a thing called anti-whiteism, what do you think the response would be? How would people respond to that?
Probably, if you called it an ism, I mean, you have to understand that these people, you're not struggling against a religious moral perspective. You're struggling against a rival information apparatus. And people inside elite circles, I mean, you know this, they don't believe that anti-white sentiment is actually a thing. They think it's a myth cooked up by the right wing. And unless they confront it, unless they see it in a real way, they will continue to believe that. That's not really an ethical problem. That's an informational problem. And, you know, that will have to be confronted at some point. I think at some point it will become impossible to deny, but we'll see what happens. Obviously, the struggle we're dealing with right now is that we don't have responsible elites. And I don't think that the Catholic problems right now come from this particular area. They come from sort of a broader problem with church leadership that I think is much more troubling. Okay, well then, since you're late in, I want to turn over. Forgive me, the rest of the gang, but sure. Dave just has had very, very little time. We have I don't know, 5-ish minutes left. Sure. Knowing what you do about the subject of this discussion, what would you want to introduce into it? Well, I mean, there's 2 things that need to be done. The first thing is to consolidate church leadership that's not going to just cave into the progressive cathedral and can morally stand against it. This is a problem because the Catholic Church is just riddled with leaders that don't want to actually stand up. I don't want to get into not my home parish where I currently live, but where I used to live, essentially caved into sort of, the whole hysteria around the residential schools. Hello?
No, I'm not familiar with it.
No.
Oh, you're not?
The graves.
Did you hear about this?
You've heard
There was this absolute hysteria that emerged.
In Canada?
Yeah, of late breaking revelations about the residential school system in Canada, and
with the graves and the rest.
Yeah, I mean, Lawrence Southern and what's his face, that guy I really dislike, did a debate on it, and this is and the leadership in that I know of, they've either sort of been moved to the side and sort of shoved in the corner, or they're just going along with the activists who are pushing this ridiculous narrative that somehow the modern day Catholic Church, is responsible for like mass executions of Native American children. This has resulted in hundreds of church burnings, and this is a leadership failure that's just got to be confronted. And I don't have a solution, because it starts not with the laity but with the actual clergy, and it's very difficult for a lay leader to interfere in that process. Then the other thing, and for religious people generally, the real challenge is to come up with some kind of bold aesthetic. I know Millennial Woes, he said this, and I thought this was kind of a real. I mean, I listen to him every now and again. He said, "This is not the right time to develop an aesthetic," and I totally disagree. The thing that needs to stand for the right, it needs to come up with some kind of brave way to confront the nature of reality in the 21st century that's more honest and sort of more embracing of the future. That's not a very good way to put it, but that embraces the future, I should say, in a way that previous right-wing movements haven't really been able to come up with. And I think that Christianity will be a component of this, but it'll probably have to, for a time, break with the direct leadership of these churches for at least a while.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting to me to raise the question of aesthetics, because I've done a previous stream, I believe Ferro participated in it, and it was on the idea of aesthetics as essentially a moral guide. And, obviously Nietzsche's project with his revaluation of all values and the rest, when he first hit the scene, he was taken very much as an artistic figure rather than a philosophical one. And I think that that's no accident. I think it relates to this same core issue of the importance of aesthetics and how they form. They're sort of like the front line of a not yet articulated impression of the rightness or wrongness of a thing. So I can
of the spirituality of a thing, right?
Yes, because you're always looking beyond or through, so to speak.
I mean, there's always truth, goodness, and beauty are the markers of true spirituality. And the unfortunate thing is that truth and goodness, I think, they might be more important, but they are as important as beauty, but they are also not something that proclaim themselves. And beauty is. And this is something that the right needs to rediscover. And it can't be in these sort of tried and true paths that we've been going around in. There can't be any Benedict option in the way that Rod Dreher imagines it, where it's sort of like hidden under a rock, or where it's sort of like it's sort of safe, or it's sort of like well integratable into the sort of comfortable trad dad sort of way of living, the very boomer way of living. There's no path forward with that kind of attitude, but there are a lot of opportunities to try to do something that's more radical.
Well, I would very much like to have you back, Dave. I'm sorry that this was such a short thing. I know I only gave you warning about it at the last minute, so that's on me.
Even if I did have warning, I just the time slot, I just never get free before 7. But thank you so much for having me for a little bit of time.
Yeah, and as I said, I'd hope to have you back. I also, Settlers Lament had expressed an interest in rolling back around, because I believe we're going to be doing a part 2 of this, because I think we've just raised a number of questions rather than settled them. And I also think that there's quite a lot of thinking that everyone's done on this subject that they haven't had an opportunity to share. So guests, forgive me for having cut you. Dave, forgive me for having cut you. I'm in a position where my obligation to you has now put me in the difficult position of my friendly obligations to apostolic majesty as well. So I would urge everyone to head over to his stream, which is starting now. It's about Queen of the Ashes, Elizabeth II, and the modern monarchy. I think there's very much going to be, I think this is definitely going to be interesting for Christian viewers as well as others. And I've had some hints that AM is going to be getting a bit savage. I'm not sure what that means, but whatever it is, I look forward to it. So please, everyone, head over and check him out. Thank you to all of the guests very, very much. I hope to have you all back and soon. And with that, please, last thing, just because I can't give you all the opportunity to shill your stuff, I just want to remind everyone that links to all these guys' channels are down below in the description. And please check them out and subscribe to their channels. Until next time, I am Semiagog, and I am out.